How many people here have done some kind of resin work? Okay. So the way I wanted to start this was just talk about what we're going to do, and then we'll go through it and then answer questions. So if you have something come up during the conversation, Ed Cole, been a member for 6 years, been turning probably about 8. Been getting into casting a lot more. Those some of the projects I've done in the past. I like the wood cast with the resin. The first one is the current project I'm working on, so I mean it hasn't been hollowed out yet, and it's still a kind of rough shape. But some of the other ones, Manzanilla Burl in the blue. The blue and the white is just a maple, and the blue is actually the wood that I pressure stabilized with color, so it got real dark. The other one is a Manzanilla Burl that was left over from this cast. So it was kind of cast together, and I just cut it off so that I had 2 different pieces. And then my mind went blank. Ash Burl, black Ash Burl. And I wanted this one to be kind of see-through so that you could see some of the nice speckling inside. So right off the top of the head, there's some questions everybody asks about resin casting. We talked last year during the Zoom meetings. There's resin, and then there's resin. And they're 2 different things. So you have to know what you're working with before you start. Everybody calls it resin. Well, it's not just resin, right? It's a polyurethane resin versus a adhesive type resin. They both do pretty close to the same thing. They both have very close properties, but they both have different things that you have to be careful about. So a resin that you want to glue 2 pieces of wood together is an adhesive resin. You can dye that or stain that or add color to that some way. And then once it cures and dries, hardens, you can turn it and it leaves a nice, it takes a finish nice and it buffs up fairly nice. So it looks okay. So if you had a piece of wood that was split or cracked, you could fill it with that 2-part epoxy. You could buy, the syringe that mixes the parts right for you. I have colored it with everything from chalk to some of the dyes I used here, coffee. Sometimes when I'm turning, I will collect the fine dust from I'm sanding, and I keep that in little containers, and then mix that with the resin. So now you have what looks like wood mixed with your resin, so it really blends in much easier. The other type of thing is epoxy resin. And epoxy resin isn't really glue that you're going to glue 2 pieces together for. Epoxy resin is more designed, and I'm going to say it's more designed as a surface finish. So you think garage floor, bar top, countertop. Maybe you have a nice vase. This vase is actually, the inside of this vase is actually filled with an epoxy resin. I doubt if you'll be able to see it on the camera, but afterwards you can come and take a look. It makes it waterproof, watertight. You can, again, stain, color, do whatever you want with that resin as well. And then you have urethane resin, which is what I'm going to work with today. Urethane resin makes pen blanks. All those vases were done with urethane resin. I think that once it's cured than epoxy resin, so it buffs up nicer and gives a better sheen or shine. I know Mark works with a different kind of resin. Kevin does a lot of resin work, and he has several kinds of resins he uses. So There's lots of different resins out there that you can try. What you need to know is the open time, the demold time, and the fully cured time. And what those three numbers are is the open time is when you squirt the resin onto your card and you start mixing it. How long before your stick stops moving? So those 3-minute epoxies that you buy at the hardware store that you mix together, 3 minutes means 3 minutes open time. Well, if anybody's ever done a geek experiment, you squirt it under, you mix it, you watch the clock. At 5 minutes, it's still fluid. So why would you call it 3 minutes? Well, depending on your heat, humidity, moisture in the air, the batch, there's 100 things. So they kind of err on the safe side. Epoxy resin, which was the bar top stuff, usually has several hours of open time so that you can pour it out, you can get it level, it can kind of self-level itself, you get a nice surface look. That can be helpful. Go ahead, Mark.
As long as you're spreading it out, in a pot, it's got a lot less time because the heat generates.
Yes, there's all these resins are exothermic, so they generate heat in order to cure. So one of the things you have to be careful for is certain types of resin you can only pour so thick. Epoxy resin, like we were talking on a bar top, really you can't go much thicker than 3/4 of an inch. Any thicker in that heat Mark was talking about will crack it as it hardens. What I'm using today is urethane resin, and it has a 17-minute open time. So I have 17 minutes after I mix them together to get everything in the pressure pot. Epoxy resin, you don't need a pressure pot because it has such a long open time. Urethane resin, you definitely need a pressure pot in order to get the bubbles not to be visible. There's lots of different theories, and I've seen different articles about what actually happens in the pressure pot. If you're compressing the bubbles that are so small, when you compress the fluid, it chemically changes the fluid, it dissolves the bubbles. There's lots of different things. When it goes in the pressure pot, the bubbles go away. That's all I care about. That has to happen before the open time is completed. Because once the open time is completed, anything that's there is there and it's staying there and it's not going to change. So you have open time and then you have demold time, which is like how long before it's finally cured. So I pour all this resin in this mold and I put it in a pot. How long does it got to stay in the pot before I could take it out and pop it out of my mold? The resin I'm using today has got the 2 to 4 hour demold time. So I'll pour it, I'll pop it in the pot. When I get home this afternoon, I'll open it all up, pull it all out. Once you pull it out, you can turn it right away, but there is what they call a final cure time. With this resin I'm using today, they talk about 72 hours. So depending on what you're doing, if you got to turn it right away, you could turn it to shape, you could turn it to the finish, you can, get all your work done, but you really can't buff it, which is the last step, for 72 hours. You can buff it, it's not going to hurt it, but you're not going to get anywhere near the final shine that you want if you do it prior to 72 hours. Lots of different manufacturers. I use Alumilite. Why do I use Alumilite? That's what I started with. It was easy to find. It was fairly inexpensive for me to start out with. If you go to Woodcraft in Appleton, they sell the quart kit, which is 2 small bottles. I've moved up to the gallon kit, and I'm sure Kevin's pouring 5 gallon at a time, or buying 5 gallons at a time. 2 kits. 2 kits. Shelf life, once you open it, you're looking at probably a year or so. But again, it depends on how warm your garage is. If you're trying to keep it outside, if it gets cold, you can kind of bring it in and warm it up, or put it in warm water and it gets more fluid. But if it stays at that high temperature for quite a while, it will crystallize, and it's real hard to get back. So that's what I'm using today. The epoxy resin, bar top stuff, is much more forgiving for bubbles and moisture. So you can lay it out, you can use a heat gun or a torch and get your bubbles out. And if your wood that you're putting into it, if you're molding or if you're making some kind of form, is a little wet, that doesn't matter as much either. The epoxy I'm using today has a deathly fear of water. Any water in this epoxy today will cause white foam to appear almost immediately and harden that way and pretty much ruin whatever you're doing. Also, again, we talked about the pressure pot in order to eliminate the bubbles. So depending on what you're doing, depending on what your project is, you would look at the two different resins, the pros and cons of each. Well, I don't have a pressure pot yet. Well, then start with the other kind. And the other kind is actually, if you go to Michael's or Home or Hobby Lobby, they have amazing clear cast or amazing cast in a box. That's actually Aluminite amazing clear cast. That is an epoxy resin, doesn't need a pressure pot. You don't have to be quite as concerned about moisture, but it has a long open time and you have to have some place where it can sit and cure and harden. Everybody clear on resin. Crystal clear as mud.
Something that can help is there are a few of us that have vacuum chambers for stabilization.
Yes.
Before you do your pour, if you go to the vacuum chamber and degas it for a minute or so,
Yes.
that basically removes 90% of the bubbles.
Yep.
And it gets rid of the problem that you have with bubbles.
You do have to be careful of Aluminite specifically that I know that I've seen where if you do too much vacuum, you actually foam it.
Right.
So there are pros and cons to doing that as well. With the clear cast, it works really well. So the longer open time, you have more time to put it in that vacuum chamber, get those bubbles out. Then when you pour it, it pours easier. You're not worrying about as many bubbles as you have. Jerry talked about stabilizing. Of course, when I put wood in a form and pour the resin on it, do you stabilize or do you not stabilize? That's the question everybody asks. Everything is really dependent on the wood. If it's really soft, punky wood, absolutely 100% you have to stabilize. If it's really hard rock, black Ash Burl, it's probably not quite as important to stabilize. My opinion and my preference is if I'm casting it, I'm spending a lot of money on this resin, I'm going to at least put some stabilization on it. A lot of people have done some stabilization. The product I use is cactus juice. There's a lot of questions out there about, well, I don't want to use cactus juice because I don't want to buy a vacuum pump. If you go to the cactus juice website, you can see the graph. You don't have to vacuum cactus juice. You get better results if you do. There's no argument there. But I have almost completely stopped vacuuming everything I do. The times that I will make sure that I use the vacuum is if I have an extraordinarily punky piece of wood that's literally falling apart, or if I'm trying to permanate the wood with a color. So this little blue vase here, I wanted to make the wood blue. So this is actually maple. I think it's maple. But I vacuum stabilized it. The color got so deep, this wood looks blue. So then you can see the resin's white. So the stuff I brought today is some Choa cactus. Everybody knows what that stuff looks like. Kind of a skeleton looking piece of wood. I stabilized it and I soaked it with color because I don't want the color to go all the way through it. I like the look of the color mixed with the natural wood color. I like that non-saturated look. That's my personal opinion. I'm sure everybody here has their own. So I just soaked it. But prior to soaking it, you have to bake it. So with the resin and the stabilization, you have to have dry wood. Dry wood is not 8% moisture, it's not 4% moisture, it's 0% moisture. So anybody here work with Choa before? It's a dead cactus that's already bone dry. And I put these in the toaster oven that I have specifically for my casting for 8 hours on top of it. Once it comes out after 8 hours, it is bone dry. I throw it in the liquid and I just let the liquid soak up into the dry wood. Typically, I will let something soak 24, 48, 72 hours, depending on how big the wood is. And I have more time than money, so I just throw it in, get back to it in a couple days. Those that I cast with those woods, I did similar things depending on how dense the wood is, how much moisture it's in. If it's a green piece of wood, it may take, and I tend to cycle my drying, so I'll dry it for 4 hours and then let it cool for a couple hours, then dry it again for several more hours, and then let it cool again. And I may do that over the course, if it's wet wood, over the course of 3 or 4 days, where I'm just cycling up and down, up and down. And then the last time I'll dry it for like a full 6 hours or 8 hours to make sure that it's as fully dry as possible. One of the unique things I've come up with in order to determine if it's dry enough, you can actually take it out and weigh it every time you dry it. And when it stops losing weight, well, then it's at 0% moisture. But I have found that if you leave it in the toaster oven at 220 degrees for 6 hours, and you open the toaster oven and reach in and grab the piece of wood and you can hold it in your hands, it's dry enough. The wood won't conduct the heat. The water in the wood does. If you can hold it in your hand, it doesn't have any water in it, or hardly enough water in it. The next thing I do, stabilize it nice and hard. Typically what I would do before I cast it, I would take these pieces of wood and throw it in the toaster oven for 35, 40 minutes before I'm casting. The reason I'm doing that is, I'm sitting up here sweating. Everybody's kind of warm. There's a humid day out today because of the fog and stuff. There's a lot of moisture in the air. That moisture kind of lays on the surface of this wood. Even that little bit of moisture can cause problems with your casting. So especially if I'm doing a big cast where I have big pieces of wood, I'll either put them in a plastic bag if I can't get to them right away, or I'll put them in the toaster oven, go downstairs, get all my chemicals set, get everything prepped, get ready. You got 17 minutes, right? You don't want to be messing around with stuff during that 17 minutes. I like to have everything set up and ready and then just sit there and kind of wait so I can watch my phone, see how much time I got, and then dry it in the toaster oven, come down, put it in my form. So what I was going to do today was I have bought this pen blank, or this blank. It's a 6x2x2. So when I pour stuff in here, I can get 2 pen blanks. If it's full, I can get 4 pen blanks. Or if I fill it and cut it in half, I can get 2 pen stops. So to me, this was a quick, easy, inexpensive form I bought a couple years ago. I've used it for many different things, and it's getting kind of beat. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take the 2 cactus and lay them in there. We're going to do 2 pen blanks. So I'm only going to fill this form up halfway. And then I've got a pine cone that I actually stabilized as well with no color. So we heated this up with the cactus, threw it into stabilization so it gives it a little firmer feel. And I'm constantly picking up little plastic containers. What I'll call one-time use containers, right? So this is a little plastic piece that had something, I can't even remember what it had in it. But I'll put the pine cone in this piece, pour the resin, and then when I'm done, I'll just leave it on there, I'll turn it off. I don't even care to get it back, right? It was nothing. This one comes apart so you can pop it all apart and get your pieces out and reuse it. I generally calculate how much resin I need. If I'm pouring wood, I'll put the wood, once it's stabilized, I'll put the wood in my form. I'll fill it with water. I'll take the wood out, put it in the toaster oven to get that water off the wood. And then I'll look at how much water I have left. That's how much resin I'm going to need. And then I usually do that a couple of days before I pour, so I know how much resin I need ahead of time. I know that this form, when I'm making 2 pen blanks, is about 170 grams for resin. When you cast epoxy resin, you're dealing with volume. Part A, part B by volume has to be the same. When you're dealing with urethane resin, which is what we're doing today, it's part A and B by weight. A little bit different. So I know there's 170 grams in here. This is about a quarter of what's in there. So I'm looking at about a 250 gram pour today. I tend to lean towards fat, tend to lean towards make more resin than you need, but you don't want to, pour 500 grams and have 250 grams left over. So you want to be fairly close. What I'll do with the extra stuff is I'll leave it in the bottom of the cup and I'll put it in the vacuum chamber, and then I have a ring blank. Or a lot of times I'll put it in this electrical tape container. And when they pop out, they're like little hockey pucks. Sometimes I throw stuff in there, sometimes I don't. And then I can make pendants or jewelry, earrings, whatnot, little leftover pieces. Here's some other things that I've got ready or getting ready to cast. We have a piece of, this is a cherry burl that I kind of cast in very light stabilizing liquid. So there's a slight green to it. And this is ready to go into some form and make something. I haven't decided what I want to make out of it yet. We have a couple of wasp nests. So you can see one is stabilized, just stabilized, and one I colored, stabilized. So these I would cut, put in my pen blank, and make pens out of. Grapevine, I have a grapevine growing next to my house, so every once in a while I go cut up a couple of pieces with interesting character to it. And then just little leftover scrap woods laying around. So I'll keep this one handy today, because if I have leftover resin, I'll throw this in the form and pour the resin around it, and then I'll have something interesting for some other day. Here's the 2 different types of woods I was talking about earlier. We have a cherry burl. This one's pretty gnarly, got a lot of bark stuff left on it. Has not been stabilized yet, so I would need to dry this and stabilize this if I was going to use it. Here's a last piece of, I think this is the black ash burl, which I haven't stabilized, and I probably won't stabilize it if I ever use it. I'll just put it in the form, and how it comes out, it comes out. I might lightly stabilize the surface just to make sure that chemical to chemical has good adhesion. You can do just about anything. Last year, my wife picked up a bunch of these seashells, and she asked if I could cast them. That's what I did. This is the second half. Her pen she keeps very close to her hands. I couldn't bring it in today to show you, but
Is that seashell easy to turn?
It's not hard to turn, it's hard to keep in one piece when you turn. Obviously, seashells are very brittle. You've turned a couple of seashells, you know that. They tend to chip a lot, so you got to go slow, have sharp tools. Well, there's worse smelling things out there, but yeah, they do smell pretty seafoody-ish. Here is the honeycomb of the beehive blank that I have out of purple. There's another one with blues. Same thing. Honeycomb just kind of laid in there, kind of, you know, I tend to try to keep things interesting, right? You don't want to just lay it flat, have one direction. So you kind of let it cock a little bit in there. And then sometimes I'll turn a blank specifically for a project, and I'll peel the ends off. So here's a couple of blanks that I just peeled the ends off, and I'll keep these for knife scales, because I do make knife handles occasionally. And all this stuff is up here if anybody wants to come up and take a look at it later. So now we have leftover fluid. We have our main pour, which is our pens, and we have our pine cone ready to go. Before I get started, is there any other questions? Because once we start the clock, I got 17 minutes to get everything in.
And I thought I heard you say before that, does the wood have to be dry before you put the cactus juice on?
Yes. So cactus juice is a stabilizing resin that you dry it to zero. You soak it or vacuum it to get the resin to penetrate into the wood. And then after even when you vacuum it, you still have to soak it sometime after the vacuum. Once you're done soaking it, you take it out and you put it back in the oven, 220 degrees, a couple hours. That catalyst, that resin hardens, and it comes almost like plastic. So this wood or this cactus is very hard, and it's, like I said, you can almost turn this just like this.
As mentioned a couple of times now about letting it soak, there's a common misconception about cactus juice. A lot of people think that when they put it in the pot, turn the pressure on and start to bubble, that the cactus juice is going into the wood. It's not. What it's doing then is it's sucking the air out. Once you turn the air off, turn the suction off and let it soak, that's when the cactus juice goes back in. So if you vacuum it for 2 hours, you should probably let it soak for 2, 3, or 4 hours, just to make sure that you get enough resin to actually do stabilization.
So other things that I'm going to use today, I have a variety of dyes that I use. I have a variety of powders I use. I have some aluminite powders and some just craft store powders, mica powders, which add color. I have an old scale that I got inherited. I have a mixing cup, and you can buy these at paint stores, or I think I've seen them at Fleet Farm. These are kind of reusable. Once you mix it all in, you pour it out, you just let it harden. Once it hardens, you kind of reach in and just peel it off, it comes right out. I've used this one several times, you can see. If I get 1 or 2 more times out of it, you know, it's the dollar that you paid for it, you've made back. I also, because of the way I pour, I use plastic cups. These are disposable. Once you mix the resin, you throw them away. And then I have some mixing cups here when I want to do some specific colorings or different color tricks. I use these little dip cups that I purchased. Measuring sticks, stirring sticks, your mold, and then a phone for time. That's pretty much everything I use. Once you're ready to pour, you got to decide what you want to do. Kind of think of it ahead of time, right? Some of the wood I use, I know exactly what kind of wood I want, so I know I have an idea of what color I want. The black Ash Burl has surface to it. I wanted to try to preserve that, so that's why I used the honey or the copper coloring on the box and I left it clear. I didn't try to make it opaque. I wanted to be able to see through it. So afterwards, if you want to look at it, the top is a copper and it's opaque, the finial. Most of the other vases are opaque. You can't see through it. Today I want to try to leave the pine cone semi-clear. So I'm going to do a new technique. I'm going to paint some dye on the leaves of the pine cone. So I'm going to use raw dye. This dye is very, very concentrated. Just a dot of this dye will color the whole batch I'm making today. So I'm going to put 3 or 4 dots on the pine cone, put it in my mold, pour clear resin in it, and then kind of move the pine cone around, and hopefully I'll get some clear swirls. I've never done it. I think Kevin's done it a few times, so maybe he can give me some pointers. But that's an experiment I wanted to try, so I figured we'd try it today. The wood, or the cactus, has a blue dye. It looks kind of green here. I don't know why, but it's blue. So I'm going to stick with blue, my primary color. Typically, if you look at my products, I stick to 3 colors or 3 color rings. I'll use 2 different blues to stay in the blue family, and then an accent, either white or black. Today I'm going to do white as the accent. I'm going to put some blue powder in for a little sparkle, and I'm going to put a little blue dye in my resin. So that's my 3 colors. On the pine cone, I am going to sprinkle a very little of the green mica powder, but not enough to make the resin opaque. So I don't want it to be clear white, right, see-through. I want it to be clear with some tint to it. That's the plan anyway. Just this dye, this is blue or ocean blue dye. If I mix the resin up and put just the dye in, it would be clear. Just the dye does not make it opaque. You'd have to use so much of this to make it opaque that it's hard. So what you do to make it opaque is black is opaque and white is opaque. Or enough powder would interfere with the light passing through it as well and creates it opaque. So that's the plan. If we have no more questions, one of the things I'm very bad at, we are dealing with chemicals here, so you probably should wear gloves. I have a box of gloves that I bought years ago that I just don't use enough because, I don't know, I guess I just don't care. But especially these dyes tend to dye things. So today I'm going to wear a glove. So I said I wanted to pour 125 or 250 grams of resin. I keep moving around and throwing you guys off, huh? 250 grams of resin, that's total at the end. 2 parts, that's 125 each. So first thing I do is I set up my scale, flat surface, turn it on, my mixing cup, and then I zero it. So that's 0 grams. Part A, part B, doesn't matter which one you start with. This is the Illuminate Clear Slow. This is just the product that I'm familiar with that I prefer using. So we're going to pour. Oh, that's one thing I didn't do is open these. Like I said, it does tend to dry and get... All right. Do we have a pair of channel locks or? There's always something you forget when you're doing these. Yeah, look at that one. Nice and easy.
Part B is always frozen.
You got it? I heard it pop.
That's a human red. Yeah, human red.
I can't get it.
I can't get it.
Now you're turning red, Kevin.
I've never seen one that bad. Do you?
Keep it in the basement,
That's why.
so it's a cooler.
Too much humidity down there.
Try the mallet. Hey, there's an idea. Hey, let's not get carried away. I do have some more ordered. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that proves how quickly the part B is affected by moisture in the air.
While we're waiting, what did you bring in here?
Oh, white chocolate covered cranberries.
They're really good. Everybody should try them.
They're delicious.
White chocolate covered cranberry.
They usually fit in the mask and then they have that whole thing where you just put it on your mask. Nobody will know how many you actually.
Oops. So I goofed up and I went 159. So we're having a big pour today. So 159 in part B, re-zero it. Now I'm just looking for 159 in part A. Go to my stopwatch, hit start, 159. We are on the clock.
You're going slow to prevent bubbles.
No, I'm going slow to make sure that I don't overshoot it because then I don't want to have to put more in.
How sensitive is it?
Yeah, we don't want to go from
How sensitive?
1 gram either way, would it matter?
Depends on the size of your pour, right? At 250 grams, I probably have 2 or 3 grams I could be off.
Before what happens?
If it's not mixed in the correct ratio, it won't harden. It won't set up right. You won't get a good buff on it. It'll stay soft or sticky. Or it can be too hard and brittle. Exactly, depending on the... 120 gram, what did I say? Thank you for paying attention. Wow, no, let's not get carried away. And this is the way I pour multiple pours, we'll call it, right? So I'm pouring 2 different things today, or 3 if I have leftover. I tend to mix everything all together in one big cup. That way I get my ratio right and everything's right, and then start breaking it off into the different cups in order to keep things even out. 55, all right, 160. Close enough. And then we mix.
So each of those is a gallon jug, right?
Yep,
You're doing it by
weight.
So is it the same weight in each jug?
No.
Or is not?
And there's not the same volume in each jug either. When you order a new jug, the one is slightly more full than the other in order to come out in the right. I don't know if you can see this on the camera, but when you mix them together, it's cloudy. So the 2 parts kind of make a milky mixture. You start stirring it and it becomes clear. It clears up and becomes transparent. We're going to make sure we scrape sides, kind of scrape the bottom. You want to try to reduce the amount of bubbles as you can. So I don't like to use mechanical stirrers, drills or stuff. Depending on the batch size, you may have to. So we're at 2.5 minutes right now. I'm going to let that sit. I'm going to take one of my cups here. I'm going to Take some white. I'm going to take this little brush I brought with, and I'm just going to paint some white on some of these. I don't know, Kevin, you have better luck with getting your swirls. Is this how you do it?
What are you trying to do?
I'm putting white in. I'm going to pour clear, and I'm going to kind of twist it when it goes in. I want swirls. Toothpicks. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, huh?
When I do that technique, I'm looking for snow on the end of my pine tree.
This to me was just an experiment, so. So there we go. I don't know if we can see that. Just got little bits of white all over. Let's set this aside. So this is starting to get warm. I'm at 4 minutes. I'm going to pour this off. I said earlier I wanted to have, well, that's contaminated. I'm not going to use that. It's got red in it for some reason. I wanted a little bit of white in my pens as an accent color. So I'm going to pour a little bit of resin in here, and I'll add white to this color. That's where you kind of have fun, become a mad scientist. Two-gallon kit cost me about $200. So resin's not cheap. So let's do the pine cone first, because the other stuff wants to be a little thicker before we pour it in. So here I'm just looking for like a snow globe effect, right? A little bit of powder. Mix it up. I want a little more. Okay. Tell you the truth, I don't know if I like that. Trying to get all the powder mixed in. That's a little better. We're going to let that sit for a minute while it can harden. We talked about a little bit of blue. I'm going to get a little fancier here.
And what's the benefit of letting it thicken up?
The thicker it is, the more you get color separation. The thinner it is, the more the colors spin together. So here's ocean blue. And you can see just 1-2 drops of this coloring. And kind of mix it up. See how dark that got real fast. I want to make sure it's opaque, so I'm going to put 1 little drop of white in. It'll also soften the color. All right, 2 drops of white.
Why you keep a toothpick on.
Yeah, just a toothpick's worth of stuff will change the color completely. I'm going to put some powder in here. You can see I'm a very exact measurer. I notice with the powders, right, you kind of stir it up, and that's why this one's sitting letting that powder dissolve and incorporate into the resin. And then we have this one here. We're going to do white. Quarter teaspoon. So now I have my colors for my blank. I'm going to have the two blues, which are in the same family. The white is kind of an accent, and then the blues on the partial coloring of the cactus. Make sure everything's kind of mixed together. So we're going to go ahead and pour this right in. We are at 9 minutes.
Just a suggestion, when you first start doing this, put your cell phone in a plastic bag.
I have a screensaver in a case. So the reason I poured this right away, I wanted it to be as liquid as possible to get down into all the nooks and crannies of the pine cone. I'm not looking for a blank that's all the way to the top of this pine cone. I'm only looking to fill maybe half or 2/3 of it. We'll let it sit here a few minutes to kind of settle. Mix these a little bit. So then now I'm going to pour this blank, right? I'm going to fill this blank. There's several ways I could do it. If I have just two main colors, I can kind of pour the cups and kind of swirl back and forth. Or I could fill the cup and then kind of sprinkle the line on top and then poke a stick and kind of make the swirls. I've been experimenting with taking this cup and taking my two colors and slowly adding it to the cup. The stuff stays separate, and then when you pour it, it kind of swirls together. So that's what I'm going to do today. I need a little more time. I like it to maintain the color separation, like you said. So I don't like putting them together in the cup until I'm about 14, 15 minutes. So I'm going to make sure my pot's ready. So this is just a pressure pot. I have a little chunk of wood on the bottom because the bottom of the pot is actually domed. And then the top. And there's air. So we're ready to go there. I don't think we're going to need this today, but if we need it, it's there. I'm going to take this. You can see the white. I'm going to try turning this a few times. I should have put 2 gloves on. It's just chemicals. What it's going to do? Kill me? Okay. This isn't working the way I wanted to. So I'm just going to kind of squeeze it. We're going to call that good. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, well, you know. What am I out? A cheap piece of... So 250 grams of resin. We're probably looking at about $10 or $12 today. Ballpark. So if I sell the 2 blanks for $10 a piece. And then the pine cone, which is specialty, we might have to sell that for 20. Kevin sells a lot of blanks. I make my blanks for my own stuff. I really don't sell a whole lot of blanks. The other thing I always have around is paper towels.
Did you touch your screen?
Yeah, but my screen protector is glass, so it just peels off. No, it always has, so. Yeah,
iPhone?
yeah.
Better protect.
Well, it's the screen protector that I bought. So we're at 1340. So we're getting there. Again, you make sure everything's mixed.
It still gets around the screen protector and then in case, better off just put it in plastic.
So these are, yeah. Or just put gloves on so you don't have to worry about it. What a concept.
Get Siri in your shop and say, hey Siri, set a timer for 14 minutes.
Siri's here and I can do that. So I'm at 1420 right now. I'm going to do a final mix and then I'm going to mix them. Half a turn so it's on the other side. We're right at 15 minutes. Well, like I said, I have about 17.
Where'd you get those little cups at? Ed?
Yeah, Kevin gave me those cups. So then just pour it right in.
If you go to Sam, you can get a box of those little condiment cups. You get about 10,000 of them for $16.
Sounds like a lifetime supply.
It is. I've given Jerry some, I gave Al some.
Made me buy them.
Hey, you got lots of money.
Yeah, buy a big box, bag them up.
He works for paper mill, he's got money.
So now in this blank, I just covered the cactus. I'm making sure that it's kind of submerged. This is about the right color for what I wanted, was hoping for. And in the pot it goes. If you stabilize it, they tend not to float. There are times where I do take one of the stir sticks, snap it, push it down in there so that it forces everything down, and then when you cut the blanks up, that part goes away. Okay, no more questions. I got to get this back pressurized. Righty tighty. This is just a Harbor Freight pot. I have a bigger pot at home, Brinks, that I use for bigger projects. I set this pot to 55. It's more than enough for the small blanks that we're turning. Don't worry, if it blows up, we'll both go. Here we go. I do have a problem with my safety valve leaking. I have tried. I need to buy a new one, exactly. There we go. And the timer says 18. I have had, and we didn't need the extra overflow, so that goes back in the pile for next time. I have had a cup on the counter mixing it as far as, we'll call it 20. It was getting really thick, and I was really worried when I poured it into everything and got it in the pot, but it was still fluid. All right. Any questions? Kevin?
When you're mixing resin, do not wear your best coat.
Or your best shirt?
You will build this stuff eventually, and it goes everywhere. And the next day, your pants is going by themselves. You can't throw it in the washing machine to wash it out, or you will ruin your washing machine.
If you get it out, you're gonna stop.
So, if you ever spill this stuff on a pair of pants or a shirt that you like, just throw it in the trash.
No, I haven't. So that's a good question. Finishing. Luckily, there's only one way to finish these. But my way, I have fallen in love with boiled linseed oil. So typically what I'll do is I'll get it to final shape, final sanding. I'll sand all the way up to the micro mesh, whatever, 5,000, 20,000s, whatever it is. And then I'll start soaking my boiled linseed oil on it. I don't worry about getting boiled linseed oil on the resin because it doesn't really permeate into the resin. And then after it's dried on the wood, I typically denature alcohol, rub everything down, tends to pull that BLO off the resin. Once it's soaked in, so I tend to use 2 or 3 coats, let it 2 or 3 days between coats to let it fully cure. And then I'll use the rest of the micro mesh to kind of sand by hand the resin area. And then I really like the Beal buffing system. After I'm all done hand sanding, I'll put it on the buffer and I'll go through all 3 wheels, the red, white, and wax. Especially with the resin, that buffing just pops that whole thing. I have used Danish oil and other things on it too, and you do have to be careful how much you get on the resin. It seems like the denatured alcohol and a little bit of sanding gets it off, but clearly I don't think I'd dip anything or whitewash anything with that.
So historically, I've done this,
Okay.
and I used it as a finish, like trying to do,
Okay, so you used, I don't know what time you came in. I know you weren't here from the beginning. We talked about, no, it's okay. We talked about we talked about the 2 different types of resin. This is a polyurethane resin that requires vacuum in order for it to cure. There's also a epoxy resin that has a longer open time, doesn't require a pressure pot to cure.
but what happened though with mine was, it's like the wood in it bubbles up on that. So I would leave it on the lathe to turn,
Yeah.
and in the end result, you still have bubbles there.
So a lot of times that's moisture or air in the wood bubbling up. Did you stabilize beforehand? What kind of wood was it?
I don't know, but it didn't need stabilizing. It's not like it was a piece of wood. It was,
So
I just wanted a river pattern.
right. So what we talked about earlier is even if it's a hard, like, so that black ash burl, really hard, dense wood. It was solid wood. So I didn't need to stabilize it. I still tend to brush a coat of stabilization over the surface in order to make that surface wood and the resin correct. Plus you don't, if you're using colors, you don't get any kind of bleeding to the wood, any kind of color bleed in. No, I've been more than happy to help anybody have any questions. This is just my process. I'm sure Kevin's process is similar but different. Jerry's process is probably similar and different. There's many ways to do this type of work. What I want to make sure everybody hears is if you're going to pour the epoxy resin, you have to have the pressure pot. Other than that, everything else can be done with your shop the way it is right now. You may have to buy a toaster oven.
You said the epoxy resin or the polyurethane?
Urethane resin has to have a pressure pot. The epoxy resin doesn't. I have built forms around chunks of wood, right? You get a nice bowl and got a big crack in it or something. Well, you don't want to like pour the whole thing in a 5-gallon pail. Uh-oh. You don't want to pour the whole thing in a 5-gallon pail just for, a piece that big, right? So these stir sticks that I have glued them to the outside of the wood and then poured the resin into that void and just cast that void. Put it back on the lathe, turn off the excess, and you're good to go.
The warning signal on the pressure pot?
Yeah, sure.
Get away from that.
I was going to say that's the authorities coming to pick me up. Anybody else have anything? Short and simple. Do you know what kind of epoxy you're using? Total Bolt. Okay. So I believe Total Bolt is in a. You know what the open time was? Several hours. Yeah. I squirt bottle or the yeah. Yeah. So 2 to 1. So it's not by it's by volume, not by weight, which means it's epoxy resin, not a urethane resin. So you don't have to put it in a pressure pot. But you don't have to put it in a pressure pot. Putting it in there anyway. And you don't have to worry about his moisture as much. Moisture still is an issue, right? The bubbles you may have seen may be in moisture. But because it takes longer to cure, that moisture can work its way through the resin and away. Heat it. Even if I'm pouring epoxy resin, I tend to heat my wood prior to pour. Throw your piece in a little oven. So you get your surface moisture off and maybe a little bit of that, just, 1/8 of an inch of wood on the outside of it is dry.
And that doesn't mean you can dry it today and use it tomorrow. You have to use it immediately.
Yeah.
Or it will redraw moisture in the air.
So am I buying the pressure pot from Forever Free Count in New Point? Is that what you're telling me?
No, because Total Boat does sell urethane resins. But when you buy urethane resins, they'll tell you it's 1 to 1 by weight, not by volume.